Okay, let's dive right into this. Welcome to today's Explainer, where we're going on a seriously fascinating journey. We're going to connect some totally unrelated dots today. We're moving from the ancient, universal mystery of the persistent human soul straight into some cutting-edge biophysics and quantum biology. And ultimately, we're going to use all that science to arrive at a radical, destigmatizing new way of looking at mental health. We are entirely reimagining what it means to see or hear things that other people just can't.
So here is our roadmap for the explainer. 1. The persistent human soul. 2. Science of informational ghosts. 3. The body as an antenna. 4. Aerobiomes and carrier waves. 5. Rethinking mental health diagnoses. And finally, 6. Destigmatizing spiritual sensitivity.
All right, part 1, the persistent human soul.
Let's start with the universal human experience. Across almost every culture in history, there's this deep-seated belief that death isn't just a final stop, it's a transition. Researchers actually document things called spontaneous after-death communications, or ADCs. This is basically when someone unexpectedly perceives a deceased person. Think about suddenly seeing your departed grandmother sitting on the porch. But it's not just the departed. People also report spontaneously hearing the voices or sensing the presence of living people who aren't physically there. These are incredibly common cross-cultural experiences, often happening in broad daylight. And crucially, research points out there's absolutely no indication that these moments are inherently pathological. They're literally just part of the human experience.
Moving right along to part 2, science of informational ghosts. So, how on earth do we explain this scientifically? Well, let's step out of the mystical realm for a second and into the biophysical. Modern biophysics suggests we can look at a spirit not as some glowing orb, but as pure, complex information. Think of consciousness operating like a symphony of vibrations. Our thoughts are encrypted into electromagnetic and acoustic fields, transported out into the environment, and then stored as persistent patterns in a universal quantum space. Historical traditions might call this the Akashic records. But the big question is, how do we actually pick up on these stored waveforms floating around us? It actually comes down to microscopic biology. Did you know our brains contain literal particles of magnetite? Yep, iron oxide. These tiny, microscopic particles act like super-sensitive magnetic sensors inside of us, and our sources suggest they might function as physical receivers, capable of picking up weak, ghostly, electromagnetic fields emitted by another person's brain or the surrounding environment.
Which brings us to part 3, the body as an antenna.
This gives us a really powerful metaphor to work with. Think of the human body not as a closed, isolated system, but as an advanced, highly sensitive biological radio that tunes into different frequencies. The sources outline a sequence for how this antenna actually works. It starts with a person reaching a state of resonance alignment. From there, quantum information from a proxy, like a spirit or even a distant living person, entangles with structures inside the observer's brain. This induces an electromagnetic fluctuation, which gives you that classic sensed presence feeling. The body then converts this into electrical signals and finally translates it into an internal bioacoustic signal. That's the literal mechanism of how our organism takes invisible data and turns it into a subjective sensory experience. Now, the really crucial point here is how this bioacoustic translation actually happens. Have you ever noticed that when you're reading or thinking in words, your throat muscles make these tiny microscopic movements? That's called subvocalization. The wild hypothesis here is that when people hear ghosts or the distant voices of the living, they aren't actually hearing external sound waves in the air. Instead, that informational signature induces nerve signals right in the listener's own throat and speech mechanisms. It's essentially a form of internal bioelectric rehearsal. Your brain is literally decoding invisible data into the familiar structure of human language. But it's not just internal hearing, right? Sometimes it's environmental vibrations. Let's talk about 18.9 hertz. That is the exact resonant frequency of the human eyeball. When low-frequency sound waves hit that specific vibration, it actually causes the eye to vibrate, which leads to blurred vision and often the perception of peripheral ghosts or shadowy figures. Biologically, this is acting like an early warning system. It's a physical sensitivity to non-local informational disturbances in our environment. Let's shift gears to part 4, aerobiomes and carrier waves. So where exactly are all these disturbances and informational patterns stored in the environment? Well, the aerobiomic hypothesis presents this radical but honestly fascinating idea. It suggests that our spirit or informational signature is continuously being shed into the atmosphere. The aerobiome, which is the literal biological ecosystem of airborne microbes floating all around us,
acts as an active conduit. It allows human informational signatures to persist in the air, creating what we've historically called localized presences, or, ghosts. This completely reframes some of our ancient traditions. Think about a traditional seance. You have a group gathering with synchronized intentions, right? That actually creates a highly coherent cardiac electromagnetic field, which can act as a parametric amplifier, boosting weak stored environmental memories so a sensitive person in the room can hear them. Or, okay, take jack-o'-lanterns, no way, right? But a hollowed-out, moist, heated pumpkin actually acts as a thermodynamic convective engine. It projects a dense bioaerosol cloud that literally serves as a physical carrier wave for local bioelectric energies. These aren't just spooky Halloween customs. They are literal biophysical transductive mechanisms. This leads us to part 5, Rethinking Mental Health Diagnoses. So we're really faced with two completely contrasting paradigms here. On one hand, you have the standard disease model. This views unusual perceptual experiences, like hearing voices or seeing things, as a biological illness. It says you have a broken system, a defect that needs to be fixed or eradicated. But the informational sensitivity model flips that entirely on its head. What if diagnoses like schizophrenia or bipolar affective disorder aren't biological defects at all? What if these individuals just possess a finer-tuned biological antenna? They are naturally picking up on those living and deceased local informational proxies we just talked about. But because modern society largely ignores this physics framework, these individuals end up stigmatized and feared completely unnecessarily. The traditional medical model has faced some intense criticism for exactly this reason. Our sources point out major discrepancies in diagnostic manuals, which really makes you question their validity. Psychiatrist Thomas Sawes hit the nail on the head when he talked about how these psychiatric diagnoses can function as oppressive, stigmatizing labels. Society pushes this narrative that frames emotional distress and unique sensory experiences as just an illness, creating this illusion that the sensitivity is somehow a biological fault of the individual. Which brings us to our final section, Part 6, Destigmatizing Spiritual Sensitivity. We absolutely have to look at the raw, lived human experience here. When you look at qualitative studies of individuals on forums discussing their schizophrenia diagnosis, it reveals just an immense, crushing burden. People report feeling utterly worthless and defective just because of the label. They face self-stigma, intense shame, and this terrifying, isolating fear that they won't even be believed by their own doctors because their medical record stamps them as delusional. This stigma is a massive and, quite frankly, unnecessary weight to carry. But there's a powerful counter-movement happening, driven by the service users themselves. Many are actively rejecting these medicalised labels. As one person beautifully put it, they believe that for some of us, the biological barrier between things seen and unseen is simply thinner. They aren't viewing their psychosis as an illness, but as a natural spiritual journey. They are actively reclaiming their experiences as an expanded sensorium rather than a biological deficit. The takeaway for clinicians here is crystal clear. The approach to intervention has to pivot. Instead of sitting around debating diagnostic categories and slapping labels on people, the focus has to be on the felt, emotional experiences of the individual. Giving people a safe space to explore what they're actually sensing, whether we call it an informational proxy, a ghost, or a biological resonance, is what actually aids in real recovery and adaptation. So I want to leave you with this final provocative thought. If the human body is the most sophisticated instrument ever evolved for navigating the invisible informational landscape around us, what if what we currently label as a mental illness is actually an evolutionary feature of the human sensorium, just waiting to be understood? What if these individuals are actually the sensitive receivers of a persistent human soul, just waiting for science and society to finally catch up? Thank you so much for exploring this with me today.